welcome to yet another episode of the Talking Foreign Affairs series with Adil. I'm Adil Cader, your host and the Kennedy School Alumni Ambassador for Western Australia. This is a series where I take an interesting perspective through interviewing key figures in the arena of foreign affairs and diplomacy. My guest today knows all about breaking barriers, not only in her home country of Canada, where she served as Prime Minister, but also on the global stage as well. I'm honored to be joined by the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. From the age of 16, when she became the first female student body president of our high school, until 30 years later as Canada's 19th and first female Prime Minister, Kim Campbell has spent much of her life breaking barriers for women. She served at all three levels of Canadian government, was the first female Justice Minister, as well as the first female Defence Minister. In fact, she was the first female Defence Minister of a NATO country. Ms. Campbell served as the Canadian Consul General in Los Angeles until 2000, and then spent much of the last 2 decades working with several high-level international organizations that focus on global issues such as democratization, climate change, non-proliferation, and the advancement of women. In 2016, Prime Minister Trudeau appointed her chairperson of the Independent Advisory Board for the Supreme Court of Canada Judicial Appointments, a role that she reprised in 2017, 2019, and will again in 2021. In addition to politics, Ms. Campbell has also dedicated much of her time to educating current and future leaders. She has taught at UBC, as well as the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Drawing on her extraordinary experience as a leader and an academic, she designed and launched the Peter Lougheed Leadership College at the University of Alberta, serving as its founding principal from 2014 through to June 2018. Ms. Campbell is also active on Twitter at A. Kim Campbell, and the 4th edition of her memoir, Time and Chance, is available on Kindle. The link to both of these will be posted in the video description. Ms. Campbell, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Sure. Let's start with some general questions in regard to Canadian foreign policy. A major theme of Canadian foreign policy is the role of independence. Canada has tended to avoid joining in very many military interventions that some of its allies have in the past. How do you see the current role that Canada plays in the future Canada will play on the global stage?
Well, you know, it's interesting because many Canadians are not aware of the extent to which Canada has, in fact, participated in military operations around the world. I would say that the two where we didn't participate were the Vietnam War and the war in Iraq. And those were both American conflicts where Canadian foreign policy did not agree with that approach. But in fact, in both World War I and World War II, in World War II, Canada declared war 8 days after the United Kingdom declared war, and were very involved in that. We were in the Korean War. We had troops in Afghanistan. So in fact, Canada has been very much involved, but we do not, as a matter of kind of lockstep, either with respect to our former partners when we were, part of the British Empire, Great Britain, or the United States. And it's interesting because we are, very close to the United States. The world's longest undefended border is that border between Canada and the United States. America is our largest trading partner. So taking an independent line in some of those conflicts has been, in fact, a delicate one for Canada, given that the United States wanted to have our involvement.
And one of those things in regards to not joining traditional allies we've seen before with other countries is sometimes the relationship between those countries, between the US and whoever decided not to join the US in those wars you mentioned, have tended to be strained. How has Canada been able still to maintain those strong links with countries like the UK and the US, despite not joining in those wars that you mentioned?
Well, because I think that in many cases we have joined. And, for example, the first Gulf War, I was in cabinet. I was Justice Minister then, and I was on the War Cabinet. And our Chief of the Defense Staff and Ambassador to the United States and Minister of Defense were very involved in collaborating with our American counterparts. And in fact, Brian Mulroney, our Prime Minister, was the one that put pressure on George H.W. Bush to get a commitment or get approval from the United Nations before going into Iraq after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And so in that case, Canada was able to, in fact, have quite a strong influence on the way America engaged in that particular conflict. And I think, we have been much more concerned about creating global consensus where we can, or at least consensus among democratic countries in using our military power, because we think that in the long run, it's very important that when we engage in activities outside our borders, that there be a clear international law basis for doing that. So, in fact, I think Canada's good offices have sometimes, had an impact on how conflicts were undertaken because we are good allies, and when we do participate, we participate effectively. And I would say the same thing of Australia.
You talk about that influence and discussing, and on the note of influence, Canada has always been highly rated for its soft power. According to some of the latest rankings by Portland Communication, Canada has always remained very competitive in these rankings, always getting high scores and remaining in the top 10. What unique factors do you think about Canadian foreign policy has made Canada's soft power so competitive and influential?
Well, I think primarily it's our history. We are not a hegemon. We were not, although we were part of the British Empire, we were not ourselves, a colonial country. We didn't occupy any other country. And we're very supportive of decolonization, very, very supportive of independence of countries that had been colonized. So I think there is a sense of trust there that we don't have a hidden agenda. I think, like all countries, we want to create relationships that will make it easy for Canadians to do business, to travel, to engage with other countries. It's obviously, there is an interest there. But I think it's because our history does not lend itself to distrust, that we are not seen as having an ulterior motive when we try to help. I think in terms also of foreign aid, we have over the years sometimes been quite generous. I think we're not as generous as we like to think we are. And that's always an ongoing source of domestic conflict in Canada and domestic politics, how much we actually do. But I think also in terms of welcoming refugees and trying to play a positive role around the world, I think there is a history there that has led to a level of trust that makes it possible for us to be helpful. I think that's really important, that if you're not trusted, even with the best of intentions, countries will not accept your advice, your assistance. And so you need to build the trust so that whatever you're prepared to offer, whether it is institutional advice, and incidentally, we work a lot through the Commonwealth. When I was Minister of Justice, I attended the Commonwealth Justice Ministers meeting, which happens every 3 years. And the Commonwealth is interesting because it's kind of a north-south organization. It's sort of like a mini UN in the sense that it has countries at all different levels of development, but where there is not just a linguistic affinity that makes it easy to communicate, but also a historical affinity that makes it possible to do helpful things. And at that time, I know Canada was very involved, which was when was that meeting? 91, I think. Where Canada, or 90 even, where Canada was helping, for example, the development of policing in the newly independent Namibia, all sorts of areas of law reform. We were discussing the creation of extradition treaties and laws in countries that didn't have them. So there were ways in which we were able to function in that particular forum, which enabled us to build on historical relationships, institutional similarities, but also that we were trusted in our ability to be helpful. And I'm sorry, I have a poodle sitting behind me. He would tell you about foreign policy if he could speak.
Would love to have him as our next guest. Now moving on to the domestic aspect and how domestic politics can impact foreign policy. I find this a lot with federal countries, that the outside perception of federal countries tends to be this very unitary identity, but in fact, most federal countries, where you look at Australia, the US, Canada, India, tend to be very diverse. And you look at the history behind this, especially in a place like Canada, where you look at historically places like Quebec with the trilateral foreign policy it had with not just the national government, but the French government as well, and Quebec having a Minister of International Relations. You, I know, previously used to work for provincial government. So firstly, what was it like the step up from provincial to federal? And more importantly, how was it like balancing the different priorities of the different provinces in regards to coming to a consensus for Canadian foreign policy?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know the basis on which jurisdictions between federal and state level were established in Australia. But in Canada, a lot of it had to do with cultural differences, because in the early days with Canada, there was the French-English divide, which incidentally was also reinforced by a Protestant-Catholic division, which seems kind of quaint now because it isn't really a big issue, but in the 19th century it was. So many of the provincial areas of responsibility of jurisdiction that were established when Canada became a country with the British North America Act in 1867 were those that were a reflection of language and culture. So education is a provincial jurisdiction. Healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction. Delivery of healthcare, provincial jurisdiction. Charitable institutions. So anytime we engage in an international negotiation that may impact on those areas of provincial responsibility, there is quite rightly a concern by the provincial governments that the government of Canada not undertake obligations that will impact them without their being able to speak to it. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was, of course, a very, very interesting aspect of that. And while it was being negotiated, I actually was working. The only time I ever served as a political staffer was for the then Premier of British Columbia, Bill Bennett. And he was very involved in the negotiations, and the provinces were extremely engaged in the development of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And again, because its impact would be very strongly felt on the provinces. So I think whenever the government of Canada seeks to engage, and particularly in binding commitments, depending on the issue, the provinces may be very much involved. But then you raise the other issue of the province of Quebec having its own international or representation, and particularly its interest in having a special relationship with France. I mean, to some degree, that's part of the desire of various Quebec governments, which have been more or less separatist or independentist in their orientation, to kind of lay the groundwork for a special relationship. But also other provinces in Canada have had missions abroad. There is a Canada House in London, but there's also a British Columbia House in London. The government of Ontario has had their own offices in various places. And those have been largely to promote both tourism and economic development, economic trade, investment, etc. So again, because the provinces have responsibility, for example, the development of natural resources is a provincial jurisdiction. So provinces that are seeking foreign investment in natural resource industries may want to have their own representatives. Now, the government of Canada feels that it is also representing the provinces and seeking to engage, but the provinces themselves very often do this. And it's, some of it's sort of political posturing. Others of it are, I think probably realistic opportunities for provinces to engage more deeply in some kinds of issues. But it's always very dicey, and there's often a lot of fancy footwork between the government of Canada and the government of Quebec when it comes to receiving representatives of the government of France, for example. But it's interesting because I'm speaking to you from Florence. I'm home just outside Florence, and on November 11th, I was asked by our ambassador if I would lay a wreath at the Commonwealth war cemetery here in Florence. Interestingly, of the 1,600 graves, only 50 are Canadian, because most of that was our biggest engagement in World War II, the Italian campaign starting in 1943. Most of the Canadians fought farther east, up along the coast. And in this grave, there are in fact a lot of Australians and New Zealanders, as well as British in that cemetery. But it reminds me that every Canadian who fought in World War II out of Canada was a volunteer, that we had conscription, but no conscript could be sent overseas. And so when I lived in France, and I lived home in France for a number of years, there are many thousands of Canadians buried in France as well. And 15,000 Canadians came ashore on D-Day. We were very much involved. And I think, like Australians, we sometimes feel that our participation in these conflicts gets overwhelmed by the American involvement. And yet the Australians were very brave and very active participants in some of the most difficult battles in both the World Wars. wars and others, Korea and others. But what was interesting to me when I think about Charles de Gaulle coming to Canada and, standing on the balcony in Montreal and saying, "Vive le Québec libre," aside from the fact that it was incredibly offensive, but what was really offensive about it is that when we had our referendum on conscription in World War II, Quebecers largely voted against it. They were not interested in being conscripted to fight in Europe. Now, many Quebecers did volunteer to go overseas, but those Canadians who lie in the graves throughout France, who came to liberate France from the Nazis, most of them were not Quebecers, and they were all volunteers. And so it was incredibly offensive, this notion that somehow, first of all, in Canada, Quebecers have the right to vote and there is no constitutional right to secede, but there is a recognition that if there really was a clear commitment to go their own way, there would have to be some kind of negotiation, some kind of an arrangement. But it is interesting that so the French play politics with it as well, I guess is what I'm trying to say, that it often suits them to stir up trouble and interfere in a way that's kind of offensive. But when you look at the history of things, it was really, aside from being diplomatically outrageous, it was unbelievably ungrateful for the president of France to make that statement in the country whose citizens from all across the country had volunteered to come and fight and liberate France from the Nazis. So that's my personal view on that subject.
You talk about multilateralism, and obviously the big multilateral body, the United Nations. Knowing your 1993 UN Heads of States General Debate speech, you emphasized the role of peacekeeping. Of course, the following year, we had the horrific genocide in Rwanda, but in your speech, you kind of expressed concerns in regards to escalations in conflicts in Somalia, Bosnia, and Angola at the time. How would you assess the UN's role in peacekeeping since then, and how do you see Canada's future in peacekeeping?
Well, Canada likes to take pride in being one of the early architects of peacekeeping, and Lester Pearson and the whole thing in the Middle East. But I think peacekeeping is a reflection of whatever the UN members are prepared to do. What it does is it creates, again, a global legitimacy for military presence. But the whole idea of peacekeeping was to try and separate combatants, to provide an opportunity for conflicts to cool off and to create possibilities for peace. But Canada, we were in Cyprus for 28 years or something. We began to feel that maybe we were part of the problem and not part of the solution, given that the conflict hadn't improved. But I think that the idea of peacekeeping, as I say, for non-belligerent parties to be able to be a buffer between those who are fighting. But as we saw in Rwanda, and Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian general who was head of the peacekeeping mission there, and suffered terrible psychological problems after that because of the anguish over his impotence in being able to actually protect people who had come to him for support, because his mandate, and he could not get the approval to engage in actual conflict. So there are huge weaknesses and lacunae in the laws relating to peacekeeping. And this has arisen, like Gareth Evans, your former foreign minister, whom I got to know when I was on the crisis group, this doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which was designed to try and create a global norm, an international legal norm that would justify countries engaging to protect, because that's not what we have yet. We've talked about it, but and there have been some changes in rules, but peacekeeping is only as good as the political will and capability of the countries who are prepared to engage in it. And at the end of the day, the United Nations is an organization of sovereign states, and they share their sovereignty and give some of it up in the interest of rules voluntarily, but not all have the same commitment to the value in doing that. And, when I think about what the world was like prior to World War II, we really have come a long way, but even the notion of peacekeeping has not enabled us to put an end to conflict. And Whether we will ever get there, I don't know. But the stakes are very high as we become more lethal in our ability to engage in conflict.
That's true. And during your time when you were Prime Minister, there are two very specific global events that you saw through, and I'm very keen to hear your reflection of that. Firstly was one of the big events during your time in office was the eventual developments in South Africa, moving to a democratic country, Nelson Mandela's eventual release and becoming the president. Nelson Mandela had a very close relationship with Canada, and it was under your prime ministership that Canada lifted the last of its trade sanctions against South Africa at Mandela's request. Just reflect on what that period of time was like.
Well, I was a minister, but I was still a junior minister when Nelson Mandela came to Canada after he was released from prison, when Winnie Mandela came and addressed the Canadian Parliament. And Brian Mulroney, I think it's very much to his credit that in the Commonwealth, he really pushed for declarations against apartheid and support for Mandela and sanctions. And Margaret Thatcher was not very supportive. And, it's not that she didn't think apartheid was a bad thing. I think she thought that sanctions were not going to be very helpful. And Brian Mulroney really, really pushed for that. And incidentally, it was the Canadian Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, who was responsible for South Africa being kicked out of the Commonwealth. Because when he was Prime Minister of the Commonwealth, he basically said, get rid of it or get out. And that's when South Africa left the Commonwealth, and it was Prime Minister Diefenbaker. And so Canada had a long history of that. But, sanctions are difficult, and, there's always these arguments, do they really work? And I think Brian Mulroney had a very clear vision and was very responsible. And so we were very gratified when Nelson Mandela made us one of his first stops in his post-prison life. And we were very, very, very proud of him. But it was incredibly moving. And I was very honored to be invited to be part of the Canadian delegation with Prime Minister Harper to go to Nelson Mandela's funeral. And that was, extraordinary. I met Nelson Mandela after I was out of office. I met him more personally when I attended the World AIDS Conference in Barcelona in 2004, because he was very involved in the battle against HIV/AIDS. So a remarkable man. But I think that Canada's role in South Africa, I think, was a good one, and one that I think Canadians can be proud of, and one that wasn't. There were a lot of people who, didn't support it in the sense that they thought, well, it's not going to make any difference. Why do that? And it's interesting because sanctions don't necessarily make a difference in the country that you're sanctioning, in the sense that often it makes the party that you're sanctioning cohere even more strongly, become even more resistant. But at the end of the day, that historical record of where you stood can be very important. And I think Nelson Mandela and his allies wanted, even though they knew it was going to be a cost on South African society, they believed that was more important than just allowing the apartheid regime to function without any kind of international opprobrium.
I think that ties in well to the point you were making earlier on about the morality being a central theme in Canadian foreign policy and how that's impacted its soft power. So I'm sure that the support from Mandela that Canada provided had very positive impacts for Canadian soft power.
I think so. And again, this goes back to this notion whether people trust you. And, Canadians are not angels. Our society, we are human beings like anyone else. And in some ways, we've been affected by American society, both good and bad. And we know, we're looking at recent events in the United States, that there are Americans who have a very interesting view about American society, Americans who go to school and learn that the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about Northern overreach, some kind of scary things. And that some of that thinking and influence can be felt in Canada too. We have to save our own souls here. We have to keep our own vision. But I think at the end of the day, maybe because we don't have the power to have the kind of hubris that Americans have, or that they are able to get away with, that we have to be more sharing, perhaps. But we have chapters in our history, you know, the head tax on Chinese immigrants. We weren't particularly helpful to Jews in World War II. I mean, there's a lot of things that Canadians need to look at. And we've just recently had a process, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, about our Indigenous people and the residential schools that were so destructive, not only of individual lives, but of Indigenous culture. That has forced us to face something that we don't really want to face. But I think that countries that are willing to at least face their histories and challenge the narratives that may in fact be exclusionary and become undeservedly comforting in terms of the decisions that countries have made, that those are countries that have a chance to improve, to get better, and to progress. And I think when other countries see that you at least have that willingness, that you're not claiming to be perfect, but you are willing to address your own faults, then they trust you, and your desire to share your successes and what you know and what has worked for you institutionally and in helping to empower people, you know, that helps very much your ability to make a difference in the world. And it's very gratifying to be able to do that.
And on that note of making differences and building relations, something else that was very pertinent in global affairs during the time in office was you were Prime Minister and even Defence Minister not that long after the Cold War ended. What was it like, the atmosphere in regards to building relationships with Russia and also the other newly formed Soviet countries?
Well, you know, I was a Soviet specialist in my youth. And in 1972, I spent 3 months in the Soviet Union when I was a graduate student at the London School of Economics. So this was an area of the world that I knew a lot about. And when I was still a junior minister, I think it was even before I became Justice Minister, we had Mikhail Gorbachev came. He was the Minister of Agriculture, the Secretary of Agriculture in the Soviet government. And Shevardnadze, they were both ministers in the Soviet. They came to Canada and had a visit. And it was very, very interesting. Then when I became Minister of National Defence and went to my first NATO meeting, the meeting was with the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, which was the former Warsaw Pact countries that, you know, the Soviet Union had come to an end, and the Warsaw Pact countries, many of them had become independent. And they were meeting, their defense ministers were meeting with the NATO defense ministers in NATO headquarters in Brussels. And I remember sitting at the table, and there was Pavel Grachov, the Russian, sitting across from me, and the Czechoslovak, as they then were, minister was to my left. And I'm thinking, you know, should they be here? I mean, this is NATO. I mean, who'd have thunk it to have these people there sitting around the same table? But it was actually a kind of a wonderful concrete demonstration of what had changed. And what was interesting is that when the Cold War came to an end, so the former Soviet and American senior military staff met to talk about how they had looked at things during the Cold War. And what they discovered is that the Soviet military leaders did not believe that they could survive a nuclear war. They thought if there was a nuclear war, their society as they knew it would not survive. And the Americans felt the same way about a nuclear war for them. But each side thought that the other thought it could win a nuclear war. And so each side was concerned that the other might launch a nuclear war. And so it was interesting when they finally were able to meet and share their narratives to discover that, notwithstanding all of the intelligence and the entrails looking at, because when you were a Soviet specialist, you know, you had to sort of look at, follow who was going who, what was in the latest document from the Soviet General Staff, and, how you tried to figure out what people were really thinking. And of course, they did the same things, about putting spies and listening and whatever, that how they got it wrong, which it was really kind of humbling. But it was a very exciting time. And of course now, and just before I was speaking to you, I've been watching Alexei Navalny's, the video he has just released about Putin and Putin's corruption. And, you can take the boy out of the Soviet Union, but you can't take the Soviet Union out of the boy. I mean, Vladimir Putin is really a chip off the old Soviet bloc. And it's just really interesting to see how power structures that are very much centered on the top. In the Soviet Union, people were pulled up from the top, that it was senior leaders who pulled their own proteges up, as opposed to people being pushed up from the bottom through popular support or working their way up through institutions. And of course, it's the same thing now with this sort of oligarchic power structure there. Very worried. But then you see somebody like Navalny and all these others, Nemtsov, the late Boris Nemtsov, and you see the demonstrations and you realize how brave these people are because what they're putting on the line. And for myself, and this is in terms of both foreign policy and domestic policy, I think how lucky we are in your country and my country that none of us has to be that brave. That if we preserve our democracy and our democratic institutions, we will never have to be like those people in the streets risking their lives to try and change the power structure and restore some democratic norms. So the end of the Cold War was a great and wonderful thing, but it was not a total transformation of power in the Soviet Union, that unfortunately the efforts to create democracy got euchred by a KGB agent, a low-level KGB agent who saw his main chance and has now created a very undemocratic oligarchic structure.
And now moving on to the segment of more personal reflections during your time in office, and touching on the answer where you said being in the meeting room for defense ministers' meeting, you were the first female defense minister of a NATO country. And what was it like being the only female at the table during that period of time at the defense ministers' meeting?
Yeah, I had actually attended the Munich Security Summit, but as justice minister, I think. No, maybe I was defense minister. Yeah, no, I think I was. I did go to the Munich. So I did. I started because I did some things foreign policy oriented when I had the justice portfolio. I was the second woman in the world to be a defense minister. The first was Elizabeth Wren in Finland. And we didn't meet at the time. I think she might have just been out of office when I became defense minister, but we met years later and she said how eager she had been to meet me. And since then, there have been quite a few, but not a huge number. I mean, Michelle Bachelet, who is the president the second time of Chile, was defense minister before she became president. France has had a woman. Norway's had a woman. I think some Eastern countries have had a woman. But it's interesting, when I would visit China, the Chinese were much more interested in the fact that I was Minister of Defense than that I was Prime Minister. Because for them, first of all, they couldn't understand how I could be Minister of Defense and not having been in the military. And I tried to explain the concept of civilian control of military, which is such an integral part of our democratic culture. But it was very exciting. But it was interesting because in my first career, I had been a Soviet specialist. But I also had done a lot of work in international relations, and I taught strategic studies. So when I became defense minister, I actually knew quite a lot about the whole nuclear concept, although at the end of the Cold War, that was now no longer going to be the most important focus for the development of defense policy. But so although I didn't have a military background, I did have some familiarity with defense and international strategic thinking. So it was very interesting for me to be in that portfolio, and it was also interesting for me because when you are a minister of defense, if you were a minister like Minister of Justice or Minister of Indian Affairs, whatever, you have your public servants, and there's the minister and the minister's staff, and all those kind of political aspects, and then there's the public service and the deputy minister and all of the experts and the people who are directors, et cetera, who help advise the minister and help you translate policy ideas into actions, et cetera. And it's a kind of a one-on-one. In defense, it's more like a ménage à trois, because you have the minister's office, then you have the civilian public service, then you have the military. And the civilian public service and the military, of course, have a much more enduring relationship than either has with the minister, because ministers come and go. I mean, as governments change. I mean, even a long-serving minister of defense might serve for 4 years in a mandate or so long. But the chief of defense staff and all the senior military, they've worked their way up, and the deputy minister and all of those people are there. So it was as a ministerial position, it was very interesting. And I also had a very interesting situation because we had a scandal, an atrocity that was committed in Somalia. And the document that was the incident report that was given to me, that was signed off on by senior military, was, as I was to discover later after I was out of office, was a lie. And this notion that you could get away with lying to the minister was really kind of worrisome. So that there's a way that the civilian staff and the military got to close ranks to defend the military, and the minister isn't necessarily in the know. And which was very stupid because, in fact, the military wound up paying a price for that when eventually, when all of the things were learned about the lies that had been told and the mistakes that had been made that had resulted in this terrible crime that was committed in Somalia, the Canadian Airborne Division was disbanded. So, crime doesn't pay. Be honest with your minister, and then you will have support to help fix what's broken, as opposed to trying to cover things up, which will then, come back to bite you. But it was a very, very interesting thing. I mean, it was quite, in fact, when this thing happened, I didn't trust the advice I was getting from the Judge Advocate General's department, the military lawyers. And happily, because I'd been Justice Minister for 3 years, I assembled a group of people, including my former deputy from Justice, who was a man of impeccable integrity. And I said, what can I do? Because people kept saying to me, oh, you can't do anything. These things are, are under investigation and there's nothing the minister could do. And I'm thinking, this is a terrible thing. As minister, I have to be able to do something. Certainly, I have to go as far as I can go until we get into actual criminal charges. I need, what is my obligation? Is there a problem with the training? Is there something systemic in the department? I need to know about it. And but I could easily have been sort of steamrollered by my officials if I had not had the confidence and the legal instincts as a former justice minister to know that the advice I was getting was not optimal and to reach out to an independent source of legal advice within the government to help me. So it's a long answer to a short question, but being Minister of National Defense, and you see this now with the new American Secretary of Defense, who is a former general, and there's always a concern that if it's a former military person, they'll be too close and not be critical enough, that they'll be captive of the military. On the other hand, he probably knows where a lot of the bodies are buried, and if I may use that metaphor, but it is somebody that cannot be accused by anybody in the military of not understanding what the military is about. So this whole idea of civilian control of the military in a democracy is problematic, but deeply, deeply important for the survival of democracy. And again, in foreign policy, for the effective and appropriate use of military power, which, whether it's in peacekeeping or in conflict, is key to the assessments that you're going to make and the things that you're going to do.
Barriers, I guess, for advancement of women in global politics. And I know that's a topic you remain actively involved with as a consultant. What barriers do you think are preventing that have prevented that from being a woman Secretary General, or just women taking more senior leadership positions in governments around the world?
Well, I think in the last round for choosing a Secretary General, and incidentally, Antonio Guterres is a good friend. He was also one of the founding members of the Club de Madrid, and he's a wonderful man. There were some women who were being seriously considered, and
Helen Clark was one of them.
Yeah, but I would kind of hope that one of them might be chosen. And of course, you have, not only do you have the personal qualities of candidates, but you also have the regional competitions about who's going to do what. There are women who have headed important UN bodies like UNAID, High Commissioner for Refugees, High Commissioner for Human Rights, and of course there's UN Women, which is its own body. But I think, I think again, as more women are leading governments, they are building credibility for women as leaders, and they're also participating in these global meetings and getting to know people who can see them in action. So the number of candidates gets bigger. But there are some countries, I think, that are still pretty misogynist in their attitudes and sexist in their law and policy. that may find it difficult to support a woman in that position. I think we'll get one. I see no reason why a woman could do. It's interesting when I think of Antonio Guterres. I think one of the things that makes him, effective as Secretary General is actually, if I might say, the feminine side. I mean, that he is not a jerk, that he's, a very warm and, collegial human being, and, doesn't exude any of the sort of macho qualities that one might find that could get in the way of the kinds of negotiation and large D diplomacy that the UN Secretary General has to do. So, but I think a lot of it is simply the farm team, the number of visible women doing these jobs that takes away from the strangeness of them. It changes the landscape from which people get their sense of how the world works. And that's why, even though I was Prime Minister a long time ago, I wasn't the longest serving Prime Minister in Canada, but I also wasn't the shortest serving Prime Minister in Canada. I wasn't even the second shortest serving Prime Minister in Canada. I was, however, the third shortest serving Prime Minister in Canada. But one reason why I try to keep active and keep visible is to remind people that we had a woman Prime Minister, and to help to keep visible women who are breaking these barriers, so that it becomes less unusual to have a woman doing it. And I think with the UN, the fact that women in the structure have been getting more opportunities, but also as the heads of member states, I think that also makes a difference to creating candidacies that will be credible, and someday I hope will lead to a woman Secretary General.
I've got to ask this question given the time and the importance of it. You were previously a Canadian diplomat in the US. What are your thoughts on the future of the US-Canada relations, especially given the past few years and under this new Biden administration?
Well, the Canada-US relationship is fundamental to both countries. We are each other's largest trading partners. Most Americans don't know that. They think, oh, it's Japan. And in fact, when George W. Bush was running for president, I was Consul General in Los Angeles, and I was asked to go and visit Condoleezza Rice, who was at that time the provost at Stanford, and to talk to her about Canadian-American relations. And when I met with her, and actually she had been a competitive figure skater when she was a girl. I didn't know that, and she'd been to Banff and okay. She did not know that Canada was America's largest trading partner, and that there was more trade across the bridge between Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario, than between the whole of the United States and Japan. And so one of the problems of being so close is that it's a relationship that people can take for granted. And many Americans don't even understand the differences between Canada and the United States. They don't learn a lot about Canada. So I used to joke that Canada was, in a sense, a lot like the wife in a marriage. And this may sound stereotypical, but the wife who knows her husband's shirt size and shoe size and, the things that he needs to know. But if you asked him, well, what size shoe does your wife wear? Chances are he hasn't got a clue, much as he loves her. But because the nature of the relationship he doesn't know that. And so in Canada, we know America's shoe size. We know a lot about American government. We follow it. And I might tell you that with the result of the recent election, there was a great deal of relief, because much of what Donald Trump did was not helpful to Canada, imposing certain kinds of tariffs that didn't help Americans and didn't help Canadians. The renegotiation of the NAFTA, we worried about what was going to happen. As it turned out, there wasn't a lot of change, and the changes that were made were not crucially, too worrisome for us. I think on issues in terms of the energy industry, I think with Biden saying he's going to cancel the Keystone Pipeline, that depends on where you stand on the issue of climate change in Canada, but I think we're very delighted to have an American administration that will now take climate change seriously, because I think Canadians are deeply worried about it. So I think the short answer to your question is I think that relationships will be good. President Biden has said his first call, and it was to a foreign leader, was to Canada. And I think that he's been in government long enough and is savvy enough to know that that relationship is really important. And that it has that means a lot to American jobs and American security. And having the world's longest undefended border with a progressive democratic country like Canada, takes a lot of the heat off, in terms of America's defense and security. So I think the relations will be good, but doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything. We're two quite different countries. I often say a Canadian is not just an unarmed American with health insurance. We have different histories, different cultures, but we have enough in common to be very good neighbors and to learn from one another, although often most of the learning is from Canadian curiosity, not from American curiosity.
Ms. Campbell, thank you so much for your time and your contribution to the program. Thank you for all the work you do around the world. This was such an insightful discussion, and it was an honor to host you.
My pleasure, and thanks for your interest and being a source of uplifting the people. That's great.